Thank you, Lukasz, for inviting me here. I'm a little tired. I've been up since 6 o'clock. So I'm just going to read you my paper. Just to say, we're moving from Havana to Leeds, which, for those of you who don't know, is a city in the north of England. The reason why we're going there is because I'm writing a book on art school education in the city in the 1970s and 1980s, and the relationship between that art school background and the formation of multiple artists, groups and bands that emerged out of those institutions in the late 70s and early 80s. And we can say a little bit, perhaps in questions, about why I'm writing this book and the resonances with the contemporary moment, which is why I wanted to share this work with you this evening. So the paper is called Beginning at a Dead End, Disillusionment and the Art School Band. As a fresher fine art student at the University of Leeds, hang on, that's not meant to happen yet. As a fresher fine art student at the University of Leeds in 1975, Mark White found the crumbling architectural fabric of his new northern home city a startling change from his native southeast England. Startling because, ready to be pulled down, once significant buildings in Leeds already suggested the demise of the worldview that had created them. By the mid-70s, the looming structure of Quarry Hill Flats had fallen into disrepair and was only half inhabited. Originally, a bold, large-scale 1930s social housing solution to the problem of extensive slums in that area of the city, the flats were designed to roll out modern comfort and conveniences to the city's working classes. Inspired by similar visionary housing projects elsewhere in Europe, like the Karl Marx Hof in Vienna. But due to a combination of structural, social and maintenance problems, by 1973 they were judged by Leeds City Council to be beyond help, and in 1978, as you can see, they were demolished. As the building began to show its decrepitude and its crumbling concrete panels and twisted steel were finally revealed by the wrecking ball, the failures of a post-war technocratic vision of a fairer and equal society was also, it seems, laid bare. In particular, the state's inability to supply sufficient levels of resourcing and management to make a winning reality of such dreams in the long term. White said, "We were in this world in which political consensus was breaking down. What you saw was the death of modernism. If you think of Quarry Hill Flats as being an emblem of social cohesiveness, of modernist architecture and progression, all that was collapsing while we were there," unquote. White spent his first term living in Hunslet Grange, by this time another monument to the failure of modernist municipalism. Built only 7 years earlier in 1968, by the time of his tenancy, poor construction issues and damp and cold problems were already evident. As a result, families moved out in large numbers and were replaced by single occupiers and students on short-term lets, right up until the time when it too was demolished in 1983. White again. Hunslet Grange was a set of low-rise, deck access flats on the Leeds Pontefract interchange, that's a kind of motorway interchange. Hard to let, really foul. You could see through the crack in our concrete wall. You could actually see the motorway interchange, that sort of thing. The condensation was appalling. You had what were presumably at the time innovative things, like rubbish chutes, but they were never cleaned out. They were stuffed with rubbish top to bottom, pouring out, a sea of rubbish and dogs everywhere. It was difficult for a lad from the southeast of England. Beginning to understand the rest of the city was shocking in a lot of ways, because it really was the end of something in Leeds in that period, and you couldn't see what the beginning was going to be," unquote. Given such evident problems, White was living in a building that acted as daily reminder of the fallacies of modern planning. It made him feel like he was living in or through some kind of end time for planned futures. Even a dead-end time, you couldn't see what the beginning was going to be. But then, sometime in late 1976 or early in 1977, it's difficult to be sure exactly when, White, along with fellow fine art students Andy Corrigan, Tom Greenhalgh and John King, made a stab at a beginning, despite the evident difficulty of making one at all. This took the form of a collectively realised piece of performance art at a time just before the four of them became known as post-punk musicians: White, Corrigan and Greenhalgh for their membership of the band The Mekons, and King as lead singer of the Gang of Four. Special Performance, which you see on screen, was staged in the University of Leeds Student Union building in the winter of early spring, probably, or late 1976, named after a brand of cheap bottled beer, Federation Special Ale, that was served in the Union Bar. It was announced over the tannoy as an exposé of Marxist dialectics in the debating chamber, only 20 pence, bar extension applied for. This is how King recalls it, and I'm quoting from him. The performance involved conversation and drinking, the second reducing the quality of the first. We dragged in a table and dressed it as our shitty dining table. Mark was outstanding. I can't praise enough his monologue about how people move from sweet to dry wines, as dreary as it sounds, but it was acute and strangely melancholic. We each talked about banal subjects until we ran out of steam and someone else took over. I think I talked about how the traffic is sometimes busy but often not. The order of the day was to do something unremarkable, except in front of people, and not, so far as we could, act, and essentially to take up time without incident. There were other elements involved. In addition to the table and the beer bottles, oh, hang on, you'll get that in a minute. There were other elements involved. In addition to the table and the beer bottles, which we could see in that previous image, there was a brass or iron bedstead, which is pictured in this second test strip printing for a further surviving photograph. Corrigan climbed out of this bed in order to join the others on their seats. Thereafter, the drinking and the possibly scripted, possibly improvised exchanges began. King, at least as we see him slumped here on the right, appears to be reading from a script. There was also, likely at the beginning of the performance, a recording played, which I'm hoping there. A recording played of Another Party with Victor Sylvester, a well-known LP in the 70s of anodyne British ballroom music. The piece, can you hear me if I still leave it? Yeah, okay, cool, let's leave it on. The piece lasted for around an hour, though some people recall it feeling a lot longer because of its slowness and the lengthy pauses between different elements. The last of which was the showing of a film, a projection screen for this purpose clearly visible in the photograph. King, Corrigan and Kevin Lysette ran the University Film Society at the time and screened avant-garde and underground work, including that of Andy Warhol, Michael Snow and Jean-Luc Godard. The three of them had already created their own underground type film. There we go. The three of them had already created their own underground type film shot on a tea trolley along the Red Route, which you see here, in the modernist part of Leeds University's campus, then renowned for being the longest corridor in Europe. The film was pretty good, according to King, since it successfully occupied time without events. in a manner akin to Warhol's Empire or Snow's Wavelength. Lasting around 20 minutes, depending upon the speed of projection, and shot entirely on Super 8 film, the film tracks a pass down the full length of the corridor at a slow, frame-juddering pace. There is minimal editing, which sees shots of the corridor in front of the camera intercut with sideways takes, capturing the long succession of windows, which you can see here on the left. If there is any narrative, it is provided by the inevitable passage of the camera towards the corridor's end, a blank white wall which you see on the right, although as it transpires, once reached, the camera then begins a return journey, after the end, as it were, back along the corridor it has already traversed. King, reflecting retrospectively from the vantage point of 2017, champions special performance as a success. Quote, Tom Greenhalgh passed out due to drinking during the show, which was a shame as something actually happened, and that's probably why he's not in this picture. But the film ran, not many people came, and it was a triumph. The fact that something happened in a performance in which nothing much was meant to only partially marred the achievements of its aims, it seems, at least in King's eyes. The lack of a sizable audience, some estimates put it at about 20 people, is also celebrated as an indicator of its avant-garde virtue, opposed as the avant-garde often is to popular reach and appreciation. T.J. Clarke, the social historian of art, who was also professor of fine art in the Leeds department at this time, was amongst the small coterie of audience members. What White remembers as his splendidly gnomic characterization of the performance as quote, negotiating the aesthetics of tedium, unquote, made in the immediate aftermath of the event, further sums up how its avant-garde credentials might have been defined, even if the observation was more a wonderful put-down rather than a positive evaluation. King remembers White as the star of the event, as a punkified John Betjeman, able to describe a worldview that finds misfortune in every beery, leery glass, anticipating the kind of pathetic lyrics he will go on to write for the Mekons in songs like Never Been in a Riot. Indeed, the performance could be read as enactment of a morose, even depressive masculinity in its anticlimactic non-spectacle, its slumped, underpowered troupe of performers, and in the presentation of images, sounds and utterances that, metaphorically at least, go nowhere. That it was an attempt to encapsulate, through the medium of performance art, a sense of disenchantment was certainly part of the group's intention. White again, we tried to put together something which we felt would be hard-hitting, incisive and powerful, and which had something to say about disillusion and nihilism. But, White goes on, largely I think it was incredibly long and astonishingly dull, and had no great viability at all, and certainly, at the end, we felt we'd reached a definite dead end, and that wasn't the direction we needed to go. And with, I think, his tongue firmly planted in his cheek, he said, our attempt at performance art had all the incisiveness of Beckett and the power of Pinter, yet of course managed to successfully avoid both. This avoidance of theatre could of course have been viewed in an extremely positive light at the time that this performance was realised. Performance art's rejection of theatrical convention was fundamental to its valorisation as a radical form in the 1970s. Jeff Nuttall, member of the performance art group People Show and author of Bomb Culture, regularly drew a distinction between performance works oriented towards theatre, which he identified as conventional in its dramatic and entertaining realisation of characters and plot, and performance art, which instead created unexpected juxtapositions of surprising elements in a live setting, usually to generate discomforting effects in the audience. In summing up the purpose of performance art, Nuttall wrote, quote, "It is a programme for restoring the public life appetite by challenging or destroying expectations." Nuttall was one of the leading tutors, as it were, down the road from Leeds University at Leeds Polytechnic, which was then famous as the only institution in the UK and one of the few in Europe that specialised in teaching. I'm going to talk about why I'm putting scare quotes heavily around teaching performance art in the early 70s. But there was an emergent feeling, and one shared by Nuttall himself, that the unsettling energies of performance art were already beginning to dissipate by the mid-1970s, and White concurred. Performance art was beginning to run down, really, as a viable form, or one felt it was by the mid to late 70s, even if it did have something about it that was interesting and exciting. The book I am writing, addressing the emergence of artist groups and collectives in the late 1970s and early 1980s, pores over a period coming just after the high watermark of performance arts radicalism. It is a moment when performance art's virtue comes to be seen to inhere in working with performance, in working with how performance might, what performance might lead to, as if one needed to work one's way through it rather than engage it in a valorized form in and of itself. This openness of performance as a form is perhaps what made it the gateway drug, if you will, to post-punk musicianship at this time. This was true in various ways for other Leeds Fine Art students who went on to be in music groups, some of whom went on to enjoy international mainstream pop success, like Mark Armand and Dave Ball of the band Soft Cell, who studied at Leeds Polytechnic. You've all heard Tainted Love, right? Okay, well, that's the Soft Cell were the purveyors of the electro-pop version of the Northern Soul classic Tainted Love by Gloria Jones. They both studied at Leeds Polytechnic. Or those who garnered more alternative recognition, such as the late Marion, aka Kitty Lux, who was singer with Leeds bands Severed Head and the Neckfuckers, Sheeny and the Goys, and Really, and until recently was part of the Ukulele Orchestra of Great Britain. Armand and Ball collaborated on Weimar-esque avant-garde cabarets, where Armand's nihilistic scenarios would be rendered edgier by Ball's electroacoustic noodlings, and Lux was at first involved in post-John Berger-esque performance artwork, raising questions of gendered power and the gaze on the nude or naked body. Speaking perhaps for many members of his generation and directly referring to special performance, Andy Corrigan of the Mekons recalled, quote, "We didn't find our feet as a group, as a music group, until we started doing these performance things. I suppose we were trying to see what we'd get away with, see what was good. We were just messing about, really." Now, when punk hit Leeds in December 1976 in the shape of the Anarchy in the UK gig at Leeds Polytechnic, a further forum was readily suggested in which this messing about could be extended. Ros Allen, fine art student and bass player of the founding 1977 lineup of the Mekons and then subsequently joined Delta 5, usefully sums up the impact of punk and performance art together, thusly. She says, "I think what followed on from the punk thing was that anybody could get up and perform, and certainly going to the Poly and seeing Frank Tovey, another student, who became Fad Gadget, Mark Armand doing performance pieces, there was some feeling that you could try anything. It was incredible. You didn't have to be able to play music or read music to perform music, and I think that's quite crucial. And you didn't have to be a bloke. You know, there was a lovely mishmash of different cultures and disciplines coming together at the time," unquote. What I'm trying to say here is that this mishmash, as Alan puts it, this working at or across the edges of artistic disciplines or practices, sought to fashion a way of working that matched the expressive needs of this artistic generation. Mark White again is particularly lucid on this matter, and it's why I lean on his testimony so heavy tonight. He says, "I think an awful lot of the flailing around we did was search for a form. What form is this disillusionment going to take? Quite how we ended up in bands, I'm not entirely sure. We were just flailing around trying to find some form that would represent or bear witness to disillusion. Certainly what the Mekons were doing was bearing witness to this, rather than necessarily trying to create a meaningful intervention. We never had that confidence that what we had to say would make any difference, but we knew we had to say it. Such a statement involving flailing around and a lack of confidence in one's own ability to change things hardly amounts to a normative thrusting construction of heterosexual masculinity, and is the reason why the Mekons have frequently been viewed as blasted and defeated, even gloriously so, by their most ardent and supportive fans and critics. Their first shambolic-sounding single for the fast product label Never Been in a Riot is often taken as talisman of what we might call their givenness to lose.
1, 2, 3, 4.
This song is usually read in comparison to the Clash's ferocious White Riot, in which Joe Strummer sings of his desire for a white riot in the wake of his experience of black street resistance to heavy-handed policing at the Notting Hill Carnival in 1976. The Mekons, by some contrast, sing, "I've never been in a riot, never been in a fight, I'm always in the toilet, missing out the noise. Missing out the noise, missing out the noise." Here, the band exhibit their pathetic or deflated subjectivity, their seeming inability to rise to the call of history, or what John Langford has described in another register as, quote, their art school wimpiness. Such touting of purported failures of one kind or another has continued in recent years, as the band have, somewhat miraculously you might say, given their large and changing membership, celebrated their 40th birthday. When current member Sally Timms was asked by a radio host in the US to share the secrets of the Mekons' success, her waggish answer was not to have any. But thinking too one-dimensionally about the failure of the Mekons blinds us to what I think is the band's greatest positive achievement, namely, sustaining an ongoing practical exploration of the dynamic possibilities of group creation. For this is the form, the social, relational form of the band, which White and his compatriots ultimately arrive at. After painting, after performance art, even after punk, the creative form that comes to express their practice as artists is a peculiarly open iteration of the band's structure. White explains one final time. Part of our disillusion was rooted in a deep distrust of the single white male authorial voice. That's part of the reason there were two singers in the Mekons, not one. And also, the big thing about punk that people forget is that it wasn't just the band, it was everybody. There are a lot of people in the Mekons deliberately, there are an awful lot of people working with us, and we were all the same. We were of equal weight, everybody got the same wage, which was nothing for a very long time, and also, we were the audience. Often, there were more people on stage than they were in the audience, but we were all on the same level, there was no barrier, and this was very deliberate. So there wasn't a sense of an unequal balance of power, which is what we saw in the rest of the world. And I'm not going to quote from him again tonight, that's enough Mark White. The Mekons' communalist practice had many close correlatives in 1970s Leeds. The cooperative movement was strong in the city at this time. The Suma Health Food Co-op was established there in 1977, the same year as the Mekons, and many other social enterprises and creative groups organised themselves according to non-hierarchical principles and forms of collective self-governance. This included, for example, Impact Theatre Cooperative, which shared a rehearsal building with the Mekons and Gang of Four, and that was rented from Suma in Leeds city centre. Impact devised remarkably maverick theatrical productions as a collective somewhat devoid of the usual hierarchies of a theatre company and of clear-cut roles of director, writer, actor, set designer, etc. Their work was largely anti-narrative and formed instead an affecting assemblage of relations between text, images, performed gestures, elements of set and lighting, and often self-composed music. Even though not quite as open a band structure as the Mekons, i.e. the audience weren't invited to participate and get on stage with the players, the horizontal process and lively multiplicity that Impact employed in the production of their shows nevertheless resulted in an openness of aesthetic form, lying somewhere between filmic tableau, live images, avant-garde music, and theatre. As founding member Claire MacDonald has recalled, by the time Impact began to make their work in the late 1970s, quote, theatre had become a space of tribal self-education and self-medication in which we inoculated ourselves against the straight world and the irrational power of the forces of history, unquote. What an amazing quote. It's so amazing, I'm going to read it again. Theatre had become a space of tribal self-education and self-medication in which we inoculated ourselves against the straight world and the irrational power of the forces of history. Indeed, Impact Productions obsessively imagined worlds after fictive, apocalyptic, or real-world historical events, as if trying to work out, over and over again, what to do exactly once the certainties of previously existing modes of life are wiped out. How to create, from the bottom up, collectively and independent of authority, new worlds of possibility. The Mekons shared this ethos, hoping that by vacating the stage, symbolically at least, as individual performers, and providing a stage for everyone at live gigs, it would free people from the atomized conditions of pop consumerism, liberate them from the divisive music industry hierarchies of stars and fans, and enable them to become active, autonomous co-creators of a shared, socialized, if not socialist, art form. Its operating egalitarian presumption being anybody watching us can do this too. However, as the music press were quick to point out, such an idea was fine to propose in theory, and you can see that the Mekons have been steeped in conceptual art. The idea for the band in the first instance was a kind of a declaratory, a kind of proto-Duchampian declaratory proposition. Let's make music on the basis of not knowing how to make music. Right? That was the concept upon which the Mekons was founded. So the music press say it's okay to have a theory, have a concept for the piece, but difficult to maintain it in rock practice. Once the open mic scenario was actually presented, members of the crowd sometimes took to the stage and started strutting, pretending to be stars, and otherwise lauded it over their onlookers, thereby theatrically reinstalling the hierarchy of band over audience that permissive participation was designed to eradicate in the first place. The Mekons themselves, the Mekons themselves became quickly aware of this irony. In 1979, they told Mary Harron, quote, "We used to think that anyone could get up and do anything. But when that happens and the audience comes on stage, you either get a horrible, boring mess, or you get people playing Anarchy in the UK on the guitar, or pretending to be Blondie on the microphone. To think that by opening up the equipment, you thereby open up the ideology is just ridiculous," unquote. But rather than proof of the inadequacy of their radical assumptions, and evidence, if you like, of yet another Mekons failure, the lack of fit between the band's aspirations and the reality of their audience's behaviour can be seen more positively as an acknowledgement of the intractable contradictions arising from being mired in capitalist conditions of production and consumption, whilst at the same time striving to surpass them. As Harron put it, Mary Harron, in the pages of Melody Maker, quote, "In the end, the Mekons are a lesson in contradictions, about trying to work without hierarchies in a situation that imposes them, about trying to work from an ideological basis when rock music at its heart has a mindless passion and energy that blows theory apart." And then, this is me, that in all their unruly, chaotic multiplicity and the contradictions that dog their would-be progressive path forward, they teach us what it means to struggle for an alternative to art world and music industry business as usual. Because after all, that is the Mekon's raison d'etre, as a lesson for each and every one of us. Thanks.